Well, good afternoon, community. So excited to be sharing space with you this afternoon. My name is Nikita Oliver. I use they, them pronouns, and I am the coordinator for a federal spending series that we've been building in partnership with community organizers, artists, and cultural workers, with organizations like the Rainier Beach Action Coalition and Heartworks Arts Collective. Today, we have an illustrious panel of elected leaders, community members, and staff that work with our elected leaders to talk about the American Rescue Plan. And just to put this in the context of the larger picture that we are building, our hope is as we move into these periods of seeing more federal spending, how can we make sure that these dollars get to the communities that need them most? Thinking about our most intersectional communities, our Black, Indigenous, and Brown communities, our disabled communities, our homeless communities, formerly incarcerated and currently incarcerated communities. How are we making sure that these dollars are getting to the place where they are most needed and that they are meeting the need that they are intended to help relieve? In the big picture, we are building together, in addition to this live stream, a toolkit to be able to help community organizers and community members who just have a deep interest in being able to impact spending and making sure that it gets to the places that it's needed, that you have the tools and information to be able to do that. So, this is the first of two live streams. The second will be on August 20th from 12 p.m. to 1:30 p.m., where we will talk about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act with another illustrious panel. We will also be providing a series of webinars and an organizing toolkit that has both arts, like poetry from Evo Barton, has music from Rel Be Free, and images designed by Jay Rachel, Grow Miha, and Jasmine Johnson, for you to be able to go into your community, help them understand these various federal investments, and be able to push the buttons and pull the levers that make sure our communities have what they need. So I'm very excited to have our panel today introduce themselves and share first a little bit about who they are. Please share your names, your pronouns, who you are, and what you do, why your work is relevant to this particular panel today. And I'm start first by inviting Trevana Thompson Wiley to introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Trayvonna Thompson Wiley. The pronouns I use is she, her. I am a community organizer with Creative Justice, and uh, the work that I've done in regards to how this is in linked to the ARPA funds is really just going into communities and educating folks about these funds and just asking folks what it is that they need, and just really amplifying their voice. And I'll go ahead and pass it over to Brandon.
What's going on, y'all? My name is Brandon Hersey. I have the honor of serving as president of the Seattle School Board and the District 7 representative, which is Southeast Seattle. I also serve as the political director for Protect 17, one of the largest labor unions at the city of Seattle. And really, my pronouns are he, him. And the way that we intersect with this work is that through the American Rescue Plan, several districts, almost all districts across the state of Washington and the nation, received a ton of money to try to help stabilize schools in our communities and things like that. So excited to dive in more, and I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to my good friend Gurmai.
Thank you, Brandon. Hey, everybody, I'm Gurmai Zahalai. I'm a King County Council member. I use he, his pronouns. And the way I intersect with this work is that King County government received and distributed ARPA funds. And I'll pass it to Alexis.
Hello, everyone. I first just want to say thank you for having me here today. I'm a person that is generally behind the scenes. My name is Alexis Turla. I use she, her pronouns. I am the chief of staff to Seattle Council member Tammy Morales, who represents District 2, go Rainier Beach, where I live. And I am very happy to be here working for the city of Seattle. We also were recipients and also dispersed ARPA funds as well. Thank you for having me here today. Excited to talk about budget.
Well, thank you so much to all of you. I love that you're excited to talk about budget. It's maybe not the most exciting thing, but it is one of the most deeply impactful things that each of you participate in at your various levels of government, or organizers like Trey do to bring the community in, make sure we have the knowledge necessary to advocate for the things that we need. So I am very humbled and grateful for each of you to be here today. So one of my mentors told me that if you cannot talk about something at a seventh grade level, you probably shouldn't talk about it. So your first challenging question is for, can each of you, in your own words, from your area of work, explain what the American Rescue Plan is in a way that you think a seventh grader would be able to walk away and explain it to their friends as they're riding the bus home from school? And Councilmember Zahalai, I'm going to put you on the spot first.
Thank you, Nikita. So in 2020, we saw one of the most dangerous and pervasive viruses that we've known in decades, and that was the coronavirus, which we now most often refer to as COVID-19. And that created a pandemic, which means it was spreading at alarming rates. And many of our governments had to make the tough decision of shutting down so much of our economy. Small businesses had to close down. Recreational activities like gyms and other places where we gather had to shut down because we didn't want to be in close contact with each other during a pandemic. And that harmed our economy. And so the federal government came together and decided to create stimulus packages, which means lots and lots of money to go out through local governments to make sure that so much of our economy, like small businesses, don't fall and become no more during the pandemic. We also saw those funds going toward public health, getting masks, vaccines, supporting public health centers. So you can think of the American Rescue Plan as a federal government's way of driving a lot of resources toward local economies so that people could survive the pandemic.
Thank you so much, Councilmember Zahalai. All right. You know what, Mr. Hersey, I don't think people actually often think about the school district having a role in this. How would you explain this to a room of seventh graders?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as a lot of seventh graders know, a lot of your friends, the first intersection that y'all have with services, food, healthcare, you name it, is through the school district, right? And so, as Councilmember Zalahai was saying, during the shutdowns, it was, as we all know, it just wasn't businesses, it was schools predominantly. And during that time, what the federal government wanted to do was ensure that we as districts had resources to respond to a couple of things, right? The first of which being safety, the second of which being academics and learning loss, which we'll talk a little bit more and why I don't really vibe with that sentiment at all. But the big focus was ensuring that districts had the money to be able to be responsive in the state of emergency that we were in, making sure that, families had food, teachers had the resources that they need to teach digitally, making sure that the schools that actually were still in session as time went on had masks, PPE, not only for their students, but for their educators as well. The big focus was just making sure that in that short amount of time that there was enough money for districts to be able to be responsive to ensure that students and their families have both what they need in and outside of the classroom.
Thank you, Brandon. Alexis, I'm so excited to have you on this stream with us today because, people tend to want to hear from the council member, but in my experience, the staff does so much work to be able to figure out how to drive resources into communities. What does the community want and need? Connecting their council office to the communities that they serve. How would you explain the American Rescue Plan from your work to a seventh grader?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. We are a strong but mighty group of 4 people in the council member's office, dealing with constituents of over about 100,000 people or more for our district. So we are trying to stay connected all the time and listening to the community and really advocating for their needs as we are just one of 9 council member offices. But when it comes to the budget, I just break it down like your own household budget. One thing is that states and local government don't print money. Only the feds do that. They're the only ones that can make magical money. We don't have magical trees. So we actually have streams of money just like your regular household. Maybe you have a W 2 job and a side gig, and I don't know, doing some other stuff, an Etsy store or something like that. You have all of these streams of money coming into your house. It's the same thing that happens on the local government. So, local government mostly brings money in through how we raise our money, which is taxes. But when the economy went down because of coronavirus, because we were trying to protect people and workers to stay home and stay healthy, we didn't have that stimulus in the economy. And so the federal government gave one of the largest and without many restrictions, latitudes to local governments so that not only could they provide vital resources, but we did not see the economic contraction that we're seeing right now across the country, across the world. And that's what that money was. So think about it as like, ooh, we got like a bonus or we got this extra pot of money. And it was $1.9 trillion, dollars, a number that no one can even wrap their head around. How many zeros don't even matter. There's so many. But the Seattle got around over $300 million. And that's not including the money that we got under the Trump administration. We can talk about that. We may not want to talk about that, but we got some cash from them too. And so that is kind of how I explain it. It is just like how you balance your budget at your house. We have to balance our budgets at the state and local level, and we get all different types of streams of money. So this was like a new cash flow that we had to deal with that was just trying to boost our household, the city, so that we didn't go into severe economic contraction and help the citizens and residents here in Seattle.
Thank you so much. And like when I think about District 2, 100,000 people, and honestly, a district where probably most people have multiple jobs, and most people probably did not get to stay home during much of the pandemic. Like folks who are working frontline in grocery stores, driving metro, working in our schools, showing up in ways that like I don't even think I fully even understand the impact on folks' lives at that level. So such an important district to be acknowledging and have represented today on this live stream. Trey, you are a community organizer, and the way you interacted with the American Rescue Plan and those funds coming down was very different. How would you explain both ARPA and your work as a community organizer to a seventh grader?
So, what I would explain to folks, the work that I do as a community organizer, is explaining to folks where I'm doing my work, which is in the streets and directly talking to folks. Whether at events, whether in direct actions, whether it's passing folks in the grocery store, but really having the skill of listening to community. I think that's the biggest skill that you need as a community organizer, and hearing what it is that they need help with and assistance. And so, explaining the American Rescue Plan Act to the community is just by saying it's a pot of money that our government is deciding to give to folks because of the pandemic that we're in, and the situations that a lot of folks are under. The biggest thing I talk to folks about is accessible to affordable housing, and the biggest portion of that ARPA funds was to really help provide employment and income support, because there were a lot of folks I was talking to that had been laid off due to COVID-19. And also there were folks who were interested in, how am I going to pay my rent if I'm laid off? And those funds, just explaining to folks, that is something that is going to help us get by. And also the PPE, COVID-19 really took a traumatic, it really harmed a lot of BIPOC folks. It's primarily Black and Indigenous folks. And explaining to those folks that I'm organizing with, this PPE equipment that the funds are for is to really help us, especially with testing, and then also healthcare and quarantine support as well too, because most BIPOC folks who are living in low income areas, they don't have the option to do telework. So a lot of folks are having to directly go in front of folks and having to do their work, but also they need to protect themselves. And explaining to folks that these funds were really to help support them and to protect them. That's how I explain it to a seventh grader.
Thanks so much, Trey. One of the things I've really grappled with understanding, and even as someone who spends a lot of time having these conversations, was just how did we determine at various levels of government the areas of impact? And, for you, Trey, what were some of the biggest needs that you saw outside of access to PPE? So I'm gonna hop to Trey first. Sorry, you get to go back to back. But like in your work as a community organizer, what were the biggest areas where you were like, we need a big influx of financial resources if we're gonna get through this pandemic?
The biggest influx that folks needed was being able to afford where they lived at because they were laid off. Also, having access to food, that's a huge thing. Like food support, that was something I heard a lot from folks. And also having access to childcare options, because when the pandemic hit, a lot of folks, the folks that are going directly to do like customer service work, they have to drop their kids off somewhere. And so not having an option to like have their kids somewhere was just something I'd heard a lot. And also just having some type of programs to really help support the youth as far as, in education. Those were the biggest things that I found that folks just needed support with. And then the biggest thing, of course, was the PPE for sure, and making sure that they're able to protect themselves.
Yeah, like one big thing I was thinking a lot about, and I know this was definitely a struggle at King County, was just like, how do we get rental assistance out to folks? And I'm sure that there were a lot of factors that went into making those decisions, both about how much money went to rental assistance, how was rental assistance accessed by people. I mean, just so many challenges of figuring out the implementation. Councilmember Zahalai, how did y'all, I know that maybe like there are a lot of folks who work in the county, so a lot of places that decisions are made. But, how did you all navigate figuring out the areas of impact, spaces where you knew if these funds went, they would best serve our communities that are struggling the most in the midst of this pandemic and economic recession?
Yeah, I think it was really important to emphasize the principle of equity when it comes to distributing rental assistance. People who are struggling the most, our Black and Brown communities, our communities with disabilities, our unhoused communities, making sure that we're getting those funds to people who have the least access to government. Because if you just go about the usual channels of distributing money, who's going to get the money? The people who already have relationships with lawmakers, the people who already know the systems, the people who already know which systems to tap into at what point to get those funds. Meanwhile, the people who are completely removed, who are just trying to make ends meet, make it day to day, they're not going to get it. So we actually had to make a big improvement when it came to distributing rental assistance. The first round of federal funds, I think King County was partnering with a lot of the bigger institutional names to get funds out. But then a coalition of community members who represent areas that are hardest hit, that have the least access to government, came to us and said, hey, why are you only partnering with these big institutional organizations? Because these organizations are then just turning around and asking us for help to try to get funds out. Why not contract directly with us? Because we know all of the low income apartment complexes where people are just trying to make ends meet, that don't have relationships with government, the people who are living on the street, like we have relationships with them already. So in the second round of federal stimulus funds, King County, at the recommendation of these community organizations, formed what they called a hub and spoke model. Treat these smaller community-based organizations run by BIPOC communities with disabilities, all kinds of marginalized communities, treat them as a hub for rental assistance, and then treat people who are connected to those communities as the spokes, the hub and spoke model. So using them to distribute funds. And that led to much more success in getting rental assistance to the communities that we intended and wanted to help the most.
I've never heard of that. The hub and spoke model. I just learned a lot of things new. Thank you for sharing that. Alexis, at the city level, y'all had like a real budget. Like when I go look at the website for ARPA, it's broken down by areas, and we don't really get to know the inner workings of how those decisions get made. How did you all think through some of those impact areas? Were there negotiations that had to happen? How do you distribute money that is rapidly coming down, that needs to rapidly get out in a thoughtful way in a city, that has 750,000 people in it?
Yeah. Well, I just want to take a step back of when coronavirus hit, we all were impacted by that effort. Government doesn't move at a lightning pace. It's much more deliberative and slow. And our systems are not used to getting money out in such a impactful and a quick way. So we really had to learn how to be nimble. But first and foremost, the council took about a couple of months to really be deliberative after we received the first round of money under the Trump administration. We all were thinking, well, coronavirus will be over. We're going to head into 2021. Everything's going to be breezy. And then we were impacted with real life of like, this is not what's going to happen. And as we started to hear from community, and each of the offices had listening sessions, we started to hear more about folks that were falling through the cracks with the PPP, the Paycheck Protection funds. Many of the Black and Brown businesses that did not have connections to banks were falling through the cracks, or immigrant refugees that are not traditionally banked were falling through the cracks, and it was really impacting workers. Our workers on the ground who were considered essential were having really hard times making ends meet and childcare. But we also had much difference at the council than we did with our executive at the time around our unhoused neighbors, and how do we treat them, how do we deal with that, and how do we provide resources. And so we took all of that information and really came together around what is our ethos. And the council put out a resolution saying, when we get this money, we want to make sure that those voices are heard and that the money that we distribute hits all of those markers. And so I will say, parts of the things that we did well, shout out to all the departments, the people in the bowels. I mean, they did the work. We just were like, here's some money. We just did the decisions and raised the hands. They actually put out that work and worked with community to really think through. Our Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs put out over $25 million to folks, just individuals. So when we're talking about how do we move towards, I know we're going to get to like the things we didn't do well, but how do we move towards basic income, more high level thinking things that we could have done with this type of expansive dollars? How do we build upon that $25 million that we put out to people, just saying, hey, here's some money to hold you through, not, it has no strings attached. How do we make sure that not only do we have childcare, but the childcare infrastructure that was terrible before is terrible now, we continue to grow that, and have a real authentic connection for our children. And then how do we think about, as we are bringing back workers and infrastructure and housing, how do we start thinking about that differently? And so that is how we first started talking to people. We made sure that we had an agreement amongst each other as colleagues, so that no matter what the political tension was, we were able to get that money out, and really listen to community on where the pain points were.
Thank you so much for, at least just being real about like government does not move fast. And one of the reasons we're organizing these dialogues is, what does it look like to be putting new infrastructure in place so that as we do have moments of catastrophe, I just genuinely, I don't think this is the last one. We're looking at a climate catastrophe. Um, it feels like every time we're about to get better with COVID, there's a whole new variation. We don't know what's coming. So how can we actually be on the front end, learning from these things and building in the infrastructure that does allow us to move more nimbly and actually get resources into communities faster? And I think pointing to this conversation about just like direct cash assistance, where we're not necessarily telling people how to spend the money, having strings attached to it, but really putting money in the hands of folks who need it most, and allowing families and individuals to make decisions about what is best and most needed for them and their family, is really important. How can we be creating more spaces where that is a reality? And yes, there are laws and things that impact this, and how can we think about those now and prepare to navigate them again later? Brandon, I know that, at the school district, I actually hadn't even realized that ARPA was playing any role in the school district. I had only been thinking about it at the county, city, state level. And I remember us having a brief conversation. Um, how are you all trying to navigate the impacts? Because like school went from being this thing that we do in person to doing this thing we did fully virtually to then doing this thing that we're trying to figure out how to do hybrid. Just so many complexities for young people, educators in the school district to navigate during this pandemic.
Yeah, for sure. So from the school district's perspective, I mean, really, as an educator, I taught second grade in Federal Way for 5 years, and having the honor of serving on the school board, I could really see kind of like, okay, how are the decisions that we're making at the top funneling down to classrooms and being able to determine like, are we even headed in the right direction? So a big focus for us was making sure that we made a lot of the things that we did during the first round of ESER ARPA money sustainable, right? So a big thing for Seattle Public Schools was moving to one-to-one devices, which was making sure that each child, not every family, but each child had access to a personal laptop, not only to do their schoolwork, but to also stay connected with the outside world. But a laptop is only as good as the internet connection that you have. So working with several businesses like Comcast and whatnot to make sure that folks had access to high-speed internet. On top of that, for the schools that were in session, making sure that PPE was available. And then talking specifically to some of the points that Alexis and Germay touched on, a lot of the money that came in, we made sure we funneled into some of our community-based organizations because quite frankly, many of the ones specifically on the South End have better and more consistent relationships with our students than we as a school district do. So making sure kind of taking that hub and spoke model and really utilizing it to make sure that money is getting to where it needs to be. But also we have right now needs funds in every single one of our schools, which is where families who are struggling, whether it be with making a rent payment, maybe the car broke down, mortgage, maybe folks are in between jobs, could actually go directly to the principal and say, hey, I've got this hardship, and get a check. You know what I'm saying? Because we know as Black folks primarily that government is not going to be quick to serve whatever needs we might have, especially for Black and brown folks, especially in cities like Seattle. And so we wanted to make sure that we were reducing as many barriers to access to services and things like that as possible, and knowing full well that families know what's going to be best for them, so making those funds available. I think that really where I want to push not only, the Seattle school system, the state system, but the national system is all these things are great in a vacuum, and to be able to be responsive to the real need of COVID that was very present and urgent, but we need to make these things sustainable, right? We can't just take all of these lessons that we learned and say, look, oh, hey, it's dope to have a child, or rather have every child have access to a device and high-speed internet. That was great during 2020 through 2022. Figure out how to fund it by yourselves as we move forward. So really, when I think about like the American Rescue Plan, I feel like it stopped a lot of the bleeding, but the injury is still very much so there. And my biggest concern is figuring out how are we going to make a lot of the advances that we were able to make sustainable without that, consistent support from the federal government and other funding sources. So that's kind of where we're at. I did also just want to touch base on the childcare piece. We have a close partnership between the school district and the city in terms of childcare. And that was the number one issue from jump that I feel as though families really felt when it was impacted or not present. And what we also saw is that a lot of families depend on the public education system as childcare for their child, regardless of what their age might be, right? Which is why we saw such a huge push to get kids back into school so folks could go back to work. And I think if we're really being serious about like looking at education, not only as a means to like providing care for children, which is obviously our paramount duty, but also as a means for educating children and preparing them for whatever comes next for them, whether it be the career, military, workforce, college, whatever it might be. When we're thinking about what like sustainable funding sources look like, we are seeing a mass exodus of teachers, right? Folks are leaving the profession because we are treating our educators as though their primary responsibility is to provide childcare, and that is not the case. What we have to be focused on is how are we making these jobs in education, whether it be, a classroom teacher, a bus driver, a person who's working in the lunchroom, attractive and sustainable, and treating these people with dignity in terms of not only their pay, but their benefits and whatnot, in order to make really holistic school systems that we don't see a ton of turnover and that we're short staffed at every intersection because we've put all these funds in place once and then there was no follow-up. So happy to dig more into that later, but that's kind of where we're looking at from the school perspective.
Thanks so much, Brandon. I mean, and I think reality is many of our educators, many of the staff in schools are definitely burnt out. Healthcare, grocery stores, education systems. I feel like these are spaces, our public transit systems. These are really essential infrastructure in our communities. And the folks who work in those spaces are understandably experiencing a, a grave amount of burnout because there hasn't necessarily been enough resources that got to them. Part of the question that this live stream is asking is, were we rescued? And I think some people did receive support that has made it so they've gotten through the pandemic. And then there are others for a myriad of reasons that were not able to get the support that they need. And I think it's really important that we start asking those hard questions and having those critical conversations, which we will get to later. But before we do that, I do want to ask, where do you feel like we succeeded in figuring out how to distribute these funds in community in a way that actually met need? And Alexis, I don't think I've had you go first yet, so I'm going to have you go first.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think I touched on some of that in my previous comment. We at the city were able to be nimble by partnering with community to get money out into the hands of folks right away. So, little secret is can't necessarily do that with our state funds and our local funds because we have this constitutional problem. That's for another session and another day on why we can't just put money into people's hands with the dollars that everyone provides with our tax dollars. And we had that opportunity with these federal dollars. And I think that we did an amazing job in doing that. I think that we actually picked up the phone and partnered really well. So some of this non-sexy things is we were on the phone with Gramai's office. We were on the phone with Brandon constantly having conversations about how can we work across jurisdictions to fill those gaps. And then I think that we did a good job in filling the gap around making sure that our local businesses had some funds, not a lot when you have like $10,000 rents a month and all that kind of stuff, but at least getting some money out to our small businesses that definitely fell through the cracks because of the federal funds that went to a lot of big businesses and really didn't get down to the ground. So I think that those are places we did well. My last thing is I will say that I think that we did well in really thinking about how are we helping our unhoused neighbors, at least getting resources, getting PPE, getting those type of things to them. It was not a lot, but it really started to have the conversation about non-congregant shelter and started to spur that debate. And where are people's values? And I think that we started to move towards putting money into places that met people with dignity. We're not there yet, but at least it started to have that conversation.
Thank you. And I was actually going to ask later on about how different jurisdictions were working with each other. So maybe as we move through this question, if folks could, talk a little bit about what was the intergovernmental relationship like, and was that a growth? Was that an improvement? Was that a new thing? Is it something we're going to do more of moving forward? Councilmember Zahalai, where do you feel like King County succeeded?
I actually think the public health response was one of the best public health responses in the country. Of course, that's not to say that there were issues, and I know we'll probably get into the issues later, but in terms of a pure public health response to mitigate acting fast to mitigate the spread of the virus, making sure that people have vaccination and masks and all that, I thought it was really, really good work under the circumstances. I thought it was such good work that it pointed out how flawed our public health responses are for other things. When it came to the COVID-19 pandemic, Nikita, you and I have talked about this a lot, but it gave us a great blueprint for how to truly respond to a public health crisis when we care about that public health crisis and we actually think it's an emergency. With COVID-19, we saw massive flexible resources being pumped into our economy. We saw local governments buying up properties really quickly and bringing people indoors. We saw heavy emphasis on data collection and monitoring. We saw, as Alexis talked about, huge and unprecedented levels of collaboration and communication across every level of government. Now, imagine if we had that template to respond to gun violence or racism or homelessness or the climate catastrophe. I think we'd be in a much better place. And it just shows me that a lot of times when our governments say something is declare something as a public health crisis or as an emergency, it's not met with the same level of intentionality and resource and urgency that the COVID-19 pandemic was.
Thank you for pointing that out. And that is a conversation we've had multiple times. I mean, we just saw like even if it was slower than maybe we would have needed, there was a level of rapid response I don't think I've seen around any other crisis. And you started some of this conversation by bringing equity into the dialogue, and I think we do have to ask ourselves questions about equity when we declare things a state of an emergency. Are we Which communities are impacted by that? And this was a time when everyone in Seattle King County, everyone globally was being impacted by it. And I'll just be blunt, including our white and wealthy communities, which I do think played a role in why we were able to see so much flexible funding, so many things happen so quickly. And in a place like Seattle King County, Martin Luther King County, I think it's really important we have those deep conversations about how do we take that equity lens and apply it to other things and start to have those flexible resources, like you said, as we're dealing with and responding to gun violence happening in our communities or other public health crisis. And there's a lot to be learned from that. So a lot's both a critique. It's also, the success of the type of response, the level of response is something that like in a really positive way we can learn from and strategically move forward in better ways around other crises. Trey, where did you on the ground as a person in conversation with people day in and day out, you don't have necessarily an agenda because this is not, it's not necessarily always your job. Sometimes it's just what you do because it's what you do. Where did you see success?
I think the biggest, there were two areas that I felt that I saw success with this funding. Was definitely the public health area with getting like PPE and testing. I saw that. Also, just on the front of just the overall way that folks were being able to have access to rental assistance programs with getting like that information out, especially with just talking to folks and just letting them know like folks that they can follow up with directly. The community were literally just talking to each other and just saying, hey, this is the case manager I've seen this advertisement, passing it along. And those were the areas that folks were really hurting from. And also too, even just helping with our houseless community as well too, with just the funding with getting like wraparound services and rapid rehousing programs, the investments in there. Is still a drop in the bucket compared to what they truly need to sustain themselves. And the biggest issue with just continuing to help out with houseless folks is the city has a tendency to move folks around and you're not able to see those folks. So I think that if we're going to continue to be intentional with that work, is we can't be moving folks around, and especially if we're going to be investing in those programs, we need to have a way to access folks, because a lot of folks were hurting because they don't necessarily feel that they have a voice to come to the table if they don't have access to the internet, to voice their concerns on social media. One thing I was doing with the community too, with just educating folks around ARPA, was doing like social media work, but a lot of our houseless community does not have access to those graphics. So I think if we're going to continue to just do work with that, is to really just, make sure we're intentional with that.
Yeah, I think it's really important that we talk about sweeps, how they're occurring, where they're occurring, when they're occurring, the fact that like, even the CDC was like sweeping people in the midst of a pandemic is only going to make things worse. And we are still very much in a pandemic. And there are strategies that we know are better proven to make sure that our communities who are living outside have access to supports and services, but are also like within our infrastructure able to access those. It's very hard to access those supports if the small amount of stability you've built isn't there. I also very much was impressed by our infrastructure around vaccinations and testing. Was fortunate enough to get to help host a few vaccination clinics and saw many communities, lots of communities were like, we will host our own vaccination clinics because understandably our communities don't trust the medical industrial complex and are already hurting because of the pandemic. And so the fact that we were able to build out infrastructure that like communities do for us by us work around the pandemic, I think was a really powerful um, part of building a new level of grassroots infrastructure that is responsive, culturally responsive, and also does step out of relying upon some of the like quote unquote big players who tend to have access to all of the resources. Brandon, where did you see success? Because just know I'm about to ask you all the really hard questions for the rest of this live stream.
Oh, I'm looking forward to it. Where we saw a lot of success were in a few areas. I mean, the big one for me was being able to identify areas that still need work. The pandemic was really good at exposing some of the flaws, not only internally inside Seattle Public Schools, but also in, communication channels that people who were sitting in the seats that Alexis Germay and I sit in before had kind of let erode. And what I'm really proud of, at least the elected delegation from the South End, we stayed in constant communication. I was able to kick folks to either Tammy's office or Germay's office and vice versa to make sure that folks were getting what they needed. So really out of necessity, it put us into a position where we had to work more nimbly together. And I feel like that is, persisted even as we have moving to more of an endemic. Don't get me wrong, we are still very much in a pandemic, but in some sense of recovering, right? People are outside. I think what we did well, especially from the perspective of the school district, is that we are a school district that had to pivot to a public health institution, right? We had no experience in doing things like contact tracing, standing up vaccination clinics of our own, providing all sorts of various services, like making sure that folks had meals delivered to their homes and whatnot. And so the ability for us to be nimble was pretty present. And as teachers and educators always do, picked up a ton of the slack, right? At the height of the pandemic, I remember I was out with a number of educators at various schools on the South End, handing out meals, making sure that folks had all of the resources that they needed, direct services front to door, right? Delivered on buses. So figuring out how could we repurpose the resources that we did have and not only keep people employed, but also make sure that we were filling a community need. And the last thing is really, again, just going back to that coordinated communication between elected official offices, is because it's like we are now in a position to where I hope we can have a conversation around like, okay, if this, God forbid, were to happen again, who's responsible for what? What is the game plan? How do we know who to reach out to for what purpose? And really being able to identify those areas of communication that can be improved, that will ultimately benefit all of our constituencies, but especially our children, is going to be something that I think, elected officials and community members and community-based organizations are going to be able to benefit from, even in times that aren't of crisis, right? Understanding who are the people in whatever positions to make the buttons go, to push whatever button, to pull whatever lever, is a critical fund of knowledge that just was not, at least from my perspective, present, that we're now starting to build the infrastructure for. So I think we're going to be able to see those benefits even, hopefully when we're eventually out of the pandemic.
Absolutely. And I feel like that's a conversation we could have a whole live stream on, just the myriad of ways that educators had to shift. I mean, I feel like educators are some of the most nimble people anyways, constantly shifting in their classrooms to be able to meet, 30 needs at a time while simultaneously expected to deliver a curriculum that then young people get tested on later. I mean, like educators have such a challenging role, and the staff in schools have to do so much social work and education work. I mean, schools are routinely a center for meeting basic needs and became even more that in the pandemic while trying to do that remotely. So, how do you get things to folks that are all over the city? I navigated that myself as a nonprofit worker, traveling all over King County to get young people access to groceries and supplies. And, we were figuring out how do we get young people computers. And so I just, a plug for municipal broadband. We should figure that one out. It would really serve our communities. So there were challenges. Implementation was not necessarily smooth. Everyone did not get what they needed. And there is a major question of sustainability because clearly the economic impact, the emotional impact, the trauma impact on our communities is still present. I like how you put that, Brandon, of saying, we maybe slowed the bleeding, but the trauma, the injury, the wound is still there. And so how do we sustain what we're doing? What are some of your critical thoughts? What are your critiques of ARPA and its implementation? What could we have done better? And I definitely will have follow-up questions for each of you. So just be prepared. And because I think this is where we learn our lessons. Really being able to talk about the hard things so that we can prepare to do the hard things better next time is where we're going to make sure that our communities get access to what they need. So Brandon, I'm going to put you on the spot first.
Yo, let's get into it. So, absolutely. So, even if you look at the language that's on the Biden administration's website for ARPA, the entire context, right, for how this money was intended to be used, it does not vibe with me and what I understand about kids, especially here in Seattle. I used to work for the federal government as a policy analyst, and this was one of the big reasons that I left. When you look at it doesn't matter how many resources or dollars you put in the hands of folks. If you look in the language for how the intent of those dollars are to be used, you see the really patriarchal, white-focused, non-folks of color-centric messaging that is there. And so really, if you look directly on the website, it says that for education, ARPA funds are supposed to go to reopening schools and to providing safety. And so a couple of responses that I have to that are like, reopening schools, especially in a major metropolitan area like Seattle, was in direct opposition to safety. And that is in a couple of ways, right? Especially reopening schools, the way that we did in the rushed nature, it put a strain not only on the system, but our already fraught relationships with community, our labor partners through the Seattle Education Association, and so many others. But really, where I really struggled, especially as a leader in this institution, was understanding that first, what are you talking about learning loss? Because for so many Black and Brown students, the ability to learn from home, the ability to learn with their families, and the ability to be away from the really oppressive buildings that schools can oftentimes be, especially when you don't have educators and staff that reflect your lived experiences, was actually an opportunity to do real learning in a family context, right? And so when we talk about learning loss, I really struggle to really justify the fact that, so you're suggesting that we were doing a great job of educating students before, and that the pandemic was the one that exacerbated this loss of learning? To me, that's BS, right? Right on its face. And so when I think about how do we not only respond and recover from this, we need to have real conversations, right? The American public education system has been flawed since its conception. We have not changed the way that we educate children since the early 1800s, which was basically to make really good folks for an industry that just is not present in our economy anymore, right? The other thing is safety. Safety from what? Because by putting all of our students into a situation where we're mandating that they return to class in a very rushed fashion without being able to come to safety agreements with our labor partners, really put us into a position of community spread happening very quickly. And we had a number of students who were protesting, taking time out of their learning to come tell the school district what they needed in a really authentic way. And then on top of that, because of all of us being inside for so long, and because of all of the unaddressed mental challenges that so many folks in our communities are facing, we experienced a heightened level of violence, not only through physical violence, but also gun violence. And this isn't exclusive to Seattle, but it has been exacerbated by the lack of resources, the lack of sustainable resources, and folks not having sustainable access to mental health services, and all of this, that, and the other. That really put us into a position to where safety was compromised more so than folks being in their homes, right? So this is something that happens on a regular basis. Whenever there is a crisis and an influx of money with the sole purpose to fix a main problem, which was getting kids back in school, then the folks who were already marginalized before we arrived in that place end up being placed even more so on the margins, right? And the people who bear the brunt of those negative experiences are the folks that look like the people on this call. And one of my biggest frustrations, not only with the Biden administration, but with state leadership in terms of, Washington State's education system here, is that we were told point blank that we were going to have shade thrown at us if we didn't move as quickly as possible to get kids back into schools. No matter what was best for Seattle or the communities that we have been working with to finally get to a place of sustainability and trust somewhat during the pandemic, all of that was eradicated because we were looking to get back on somebody's political agenda, returning kids to school in a timely fashion. When we knew for our communities, we needed more time to figure out how to do this effectively. And we really did bear the consequences in a lot of ways because we were pushed into a position and being compared to other school districts. Well, why isn't Seattle moving more quickly to get kids back to school? Do they not care as much about their student populations because they're not moving as fast as, say, some of the districts to the north and south of us who have much wider, much wealthier populations? And then it puts us into a position to where we have to make decisions in the interest of a few leaders as opposed to the constituencies and our students who we know what's best for them, right? And that really puts us into the position to where, like, we might not have gotten a lot of the dollars that we did had we not gone back to school in the fashion that we did, right? And so when you're holding those resources over our head in terms of, executing a political agenda, that doesn't square for me as a school board director and as an educator, because so oftentimes we don't have a choice in how we move and what pace we move or whatnot. We're just like, get it done. You know what I'm saying? And as you put earlier, Nikita, educators are always in that position. We're always wearing hats that, might not necessarily be within our job description, and always forced to figure out problems that have been dumped on us from higher institutions, right? So I've got a lot of other frustrations around this specifically, but I'll leave it at that for right now, and excited for more questions to come because there's so much that we need to unpack. And if we don't do it, then we're just going to be doomed to repeat those same mistakes.
I really appreciate just, one, your forthcomingness about the challenges. I think reality was, if you were from the outside looking in, watching how Seattle Public Schools was going back, you'd be like, what is wrong with this leadership? Like the labor partners that you work with are telling you you're not moving in a way that honors them. The students are protesting. Parents have all kinds of opinions that are happening. And it did look very chaotic. And most of us wouldn't necessarily know that some of the funding requirements had these timelines in them that for various communities were not meetable. And I think that, part of the goal of this series is to help get us as community organizers educated to know, like, there are stipulations put in things. How do we push back against the stipulation alongside our community partners to be able to, elongate it? Like, imagine if we had time to really sit through, what does it look like to go back to school? How do we have the right supports? How are we making sure young people have access to mental health supports? How do we make sure their families have those? How, instead of focusing right when they get back into the classroom on meeting educational requirements, we're actually focused on the sociocultural of, like, getting young people back into being in space with each other after having been away for so long. There were just so many foundational things, had there been more time, that could have really improved outcomes. And I have a lot of friends who are educators, many of whom are quitting. They don't want to be educators anymore. And part of that has to do with the way that we went back to school without a real intentional plan and thoughtfulness about that. That was driven by a lot of different factors and dynamics that our educators, our students, our families, even folks like yourself maybe didn't have everything they needed to be able to respond in the best way possible. Councilmember Zahalai, I know that you're not necessarily on the ground floor of implementation. King County has a lot of staff that have contributed to finding ways to distribute these funds. What are some of your critiques from the county level?
I have plenty of critiques, but I'm going to just name one specific one, and it's actually a critique of the federal government. The reporting requirements. Imagine that we as King County have a small grant to give to an organization that's doing good work. Let's call it $10,000, $20,000. The federal government requires this organization, thinly staffed organization, probably not a lot of operating funds, but that's still going out there and doing a lot of good work. Let's say their staff are out there getting services and goods to unhoused people, and they're out there in the encampments, interacting directly with people, putting their own bodies on the line in terms of the virus, and that They turn around, have to go home at the end of a long shift at 10 p.m., whatever it is, and they got to fill out dozens and dozens and dozens of pages of paperwork. How did you spend this little bit of money? Did you keep the receipt for the little propane tank that you gave to the unhoused person? How much money did you spend on this? How much money did you spend on that? Quarterly reports. You got to just nonstop fill out so much paper, to the point where we had some organizations turn around and tell us, it's not worth it to me. The amount of money you're giving me is not worth it to me to have to do all this tracking and reporting. And so we kept giving that feedback to the federal government of, listen, I understand that there are some slight trade-offs in terms of requiring less reporting and tracking, but at this point, you're making it not worth it at all. You're shooting yourself in the foot, trying to put out resources in a way that makes it impossible for the people actually on the ground to keep up and get those resources to the people that we need them to. We are in full on emergency right now. This is not like a normal level emergency. This is probably the emergency of our lifetime. So if we have to get a little bit more loose with getting resources out, we have to do it, because again, so many organizations rejected funds, and that means so many people on the ground who are either unhoused or sick from the pandemic or suffering from gun violence, whatever it might be, weren't getting the healing and resources they need to thrive.
Councilmember Zahala, I think as a nonprofit worker, I think about that a lot. Should I take this $10,000 that I'm going to spend hours reporting on when we could spend that time in community? I also think, another challenge many organizations saw was maybe an influx of resources that we don't know if those are going to be sustained in following years. Maybe we brought on staff to be able to increase our ability to distribute those resources or do that reporting. Is that something we're going to be able to maintain? I'm going to keep on with you, Councilmember Zahala. I'm going to press a little harder, When you think about how some of our ARPA dollars were distributed at the county level, are there some policy shifts or things that need to be made in the future so we can actually distribute those dollars better?
Yeah, I think I'll go back to a previous answer. That's a great question. Equity, equity. And unfortunately, we have a lot of systems in our political landscape that are at odds with equity. There's one example is the district model that we have. The legislative branch at most levels of government is divided up into districts, and that means that gives council members an incentive to serve their district, get resources into their district to help the people who elected them. Well, districts and political boundaries are not naturally occurring phenomena. There's nothing correlated with them that means equity or that means people who are struggling live there. Instead, what it should be is this overarching commitment to saying, I'm going to get the resources where they're needed most. And so a system like districting can be at odds with that. Systems like public comment, making sure that listening to the people who have the privilege to either drive downtown or have a computer and a laptop and the time to dial in and make their voice heard, and listening to only those voices. There are so many systems at play that make us more likely to listen to people with privilege and access rather than people who don't have a voice, who don't have a connection to government, who are oppressed, who are working 24 hours a day, 25 hours a day sometimes to make ends meet. And so they don't have the energy or the time to go out there and try to make their voice heard. And so I think the recommendation I would make is for government to be even more intentional than we were. There were periods of time during the pandemic when we saw that vaccination was being inequitably distributed. We saw that the pandemic was inequitably harming certain communities. I'm thinking of Native populations, Pacific Islander populations, Black communities, and that no matter how the level of equity that we were pursuing wasn't closing those gaps fast enough. I think eventually it did start to track like years into the pandemic, but in the early days it didn't, and that's because we weren't doubling down, tripling down on the principle of equity and saying we're going to put resources where they're needed most. And not only are we going to do that, we're going to proactively go out there and find the communities that need it most and bring the resources to where they are, rather than expecting people to come to wherever government already exists.
Yeah, a few things I hear there. So I appreciate that, is like, really thinking about how resources are distributed. Even if you're accountable to a district as an elected, you still are accountable to the whole of King County, and making sure that those are going out equitably. And then also, to go back to your earlier point, finding ways to strategically push back on requirements that make it impossible for those orgs that you're depending on for the, what was it called, hub and spoke model, to actually even access those dollars in the first place. There are things that we could be making progress on right now, so that if there ever is an emergency at this level, we're not facing those same challenges. Um, Alexis, I know the city gets a lot of critique for how dollars are distributed, but I also think it's important for our elected leaders in the city to be thinking through that thoughtfully. What is some of the critique that you have around how ARPA implementation happened in the city of Seattle?
Yeah, first of all, woo-wee, I wish this was the bulk of the conversation. I'm feeling the time crunch because I was like, this is where I really want to dig in and put my teeth into the conversation. Um, I have critiques on multiple levels. Let me just get started. First, to the council members' points around the federal government. While the language, while they did provide some language and latitude, it could have been much broader. I know that our federal delegation really fought hard to give the most latitude to local governments as possible. But it's not just the reporting requirements, it is the time frame by which we have to expend this funds. We have to do this by 2024. It is an aspect of, which I'll get into next, the performative politics. Oh, y'all, so glad to be in a space with all these Black people. Hey, it created this space where we were like, well, if we're sitting on this pot of money, we got to get it out fast and we got to throw it out. And we created this peanut butter model that just distributed all this money, but really was not intentional around the words equity. What are we doing with once in a generation funding that really is economic stimulus and really addressing issues around the racial wealth gap? Let's just call it out. Because that, I mean, that alone caused, we saw that was, that underbelly was just, we knew the cracks were there. White people knew the cracks were there. The pandemic then just took those cracks and then shone a huge light on those spaces. We had an opportunity to really think creatively about how we could capture land, community ownership, really thinking about how families are building wealth and opportunity. I think we missed the mark in a very significant way. I will say from our office, I was like, fine, I'll play ball with y'all on this peanut butter model, but y'all know I'm going to come back and I want my money. I want land money. Y'all gonna give me this money. So like we fought hard to try to have that voice there, to really think about how we could do that better. And I think that if we were not under the constraint of the performative politics of getting this money out and showing like, oh, look what we're doing, and we had a little bit more latitude, listening to science, knowing that this was going to have an economic impact of at least 5 years. That's what both economists and also scientists have said. If we had that latitude to spend that money in a longer term, I think we could have been more intentional. But the peanut butter model is really hurting us. And right now, Seattle, in that peanut butter model, also went through an economic crunch. And now we're seeing economic deficits that we will have for the next 5 to 6 years. We're going to go through a serious budget conversation in the next couple months, starting in September, where we are possibly seeing $100 to $300 million in a deficit that we're going to have to address over the next couple years. And we made commitments to organizations, to the community by putting this one-time funding out with no way of sustainability to move forward. And the last piece is uh, the tension from our last executive caused significant strife in that performative politics. It is heartbreaking to know that the last executive for the city um, utilized progressive language that came out of BIPOC communities, um, to further serve their agenda, but was a major disservice to our communities and communities look like me and look like all of y'all. Um, I I feel disheartened sometimes by what we could have done with some other cities like Denver did with land ownership and community ownership, and thinking about how are we going to deal with the racial wealth gap if we're really talking about economic equity, and where we fell significantly short with that funding. So I encourage folks to really engage with their local lawmakers and how can we be really intentional about addressing systemic issues when we get this type of influx of money, which I know you're going to have something on infrastructure, broadband, streets, mobility. Love to have that conversation too.
Yeah, really just thinking about how the funds were spread very thin. That's what I gather from the peanut butter model is we just kind of spread it thinly over whatever was in the jar. We did whatever we could. And really thinking about, that point of like, what if the funds could have been used over a 5-year period in order to respond to crisis as we saw it arise? Because we don't know the extended impacts of COVID right now. To your other point around the exacerbated crises we were already in, we were already in a crisis around economics for Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. We were already in a crisis in disability communities and queer and trans communities. And so, how are we actively thinking about when these dollars come in, distributing them in a way that they get to root causes and not just the surface level issue that we're seeing happening right now because of the current crisis? Many of our communities, when we entered into the pandemic, were already experiencing generations long crises. Just to throw it back to you, Alexis, as we do enter into the city's budget cycle, what are some of the ways that folks can engage? Because, we can't ignore the fact that in 2020, we had a major uprising after the murder of George Floyd, deep discussions about what really generates safety. We've even heard folks talk about how not investing in the infrastructure that keeps folks housed or having access to mental health resources increases our public safety issues. How could people be advocating for a distribution of dollars from the city that really is about those root things that we're navigating in the current political, economic, and health climate that we're in?
Yes, thank you for that. There is a part where even I am disheartened by where the conversations are shifting so quickly. You know, America has historical amnesia like nobody's business. They are just like, George who? What happened? People took to the streets. We gassed our people for 60 like wild. And we're just like, okay, now we're getting back. Safety means more guns, more police, more of that. Like you're just like, the whiplash is jarring. I think what is important, and I know everyone's tired. Look, I ain't telling a Black woman nothing about being tired. Tired, okay, tired. But we have to be vigilant. What we saw, just the little bit of money that has happened, we have gotten participatory budgeting at both levels. We got restorative justice. There were impactful things that happened because community spoke up and responded and said, these are the things that we need. That is something that needs to continuously happen in that engagement. And I think that we as government officials need to work better with community in educating how the sausage is made. We hold this, and it's like really difficult. Like, not everyone knows it. And I think that we could do a better job. I would offer right now to say, help us think through how we can do better in educating community on when to engage. Many times when we hear from community, we're like, oh man, that's already baked. I'm sorry. Like, I want to advocate for you, but those decisions have already been made. And now we're just making decisions on the margins instead of like making decisions on $100 million. I only got $10 million to play with because all the decisions have been made about the boggle situation of the budget. So I would say, how can we engage that and do that earlier? The budget is our moral document, is our agreement. If there's one thing that your legislative branch does, now the executive branch, they implement the stuff. They may spend the money, they may not. That's a whole different story for a different day. Because we had an executive who didn't like to spend money. But we have the opportunity to say, this is our value. This is what we want this city to spend its money on. And we need to engage community earlier in that process so that those values are baked into the budget and we're not continuously putting everyone in a crab barrel mentality of fighting over scraps because we're engaging community late in the game. Happens every time. And we come to Black and brown communities at the end and say, oh, by the way, what do you want? Oh, we already baked 80% of this budget. We can do a better job with that. And so I would say, how can we do that earlier and often?
Thank you, Alexis. I think Trey might have some ideas about how to do that earlier and often, and maybe even some organizing that folks can plug into. You know, Trey, you have spent the past couple of years organizing with groups like Solidarity Budget, Black Action Coalition. You know, you spent a lot of time in the streets in 2020 protesting and organizing community, in particular around divestment and investment strategies. How can we invest in communities in ways that actually generate safety? And there were some investments in ARPA that I think probably you as an organizer have some strong critiques of. What are some things that you noticed? Some things that probably shouldn't have happened, and that we could do differently moving forward.
So I think where I want to take this conversation to, and thank you so much, Nikita, for mentioning the divestment and investment piece, is when we were talking about the American Rescue Plan in the beginning, and we talked about the pandemic. Around the same time, there was also worldwide uprisings due to George Floyd, due to Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and the countless names of other folks as well too, and then the many lives that we have lost since George Floyd. And the fact that, and this, it's called American Rescue Plan, the word rescue's in there. However, I have a huge critique for the overall language of it, is because some cities were using this money to pay back debt to Wall Street. How's that rescuing the folks that are directly impacted by the pandemic? Also, there were folks that cities were, like campaigning to give more money to cops. How is the word rescue when the cops are the reason why there's a lot of oppression and brutalization in Black and Indigenous and other folks in communities of color, where specifically there was supposed to be $34 million that were supposed to be used in mental health response? Where was that money at? And also the $5 billion for gun violence. The city of Seattle, if you look at the news, you can go on YouTube and look at gun violence in Seattle. They're quick to highlight what's going on in the city with, the gun violence spikes, but also not talking about why folks are, doing that. Why are they in the conditions that they're in? And the fact that crime is not anything new to folks. I know Trump and a lot of other politicians like President Biden and folks else wanted to make it seem like violence was new, but our communities have always been in violence, and it's mostly at the hands of the folks that are supposed to be protecting us. And I think where we can do a better job at is making sure that there is, conditions written in there that there's no money that should be used to cops. And also too, when we're talking, going back to like the budgeting aspect of it, solidarity budget was a budget put together with a group of community members from different organizations, different coalitions, and we had it first, like in 2020, over 200 organizations that literally said just invest in Black and brown communities. And then in 2021, we put together a document of what the budget should look like. And I think if we're going to be talking about what the community needs, and we're saying, hey, we want to bring community to the table and hear what they want to hear, what they have to say, looking at that document right now will tell you what community needs and where we can take the money from. The fact that there's going to be a deficit of 100 to 300 million, I know where we could take that money from and where we can put that money into community. We can divest it from, from the officers that are oppressing, the Black kids in South Seattle. We can take it from, the folks that are, issuing tickets, for folks, traffic tickets and things like that, where we can put the money into transportation, housing, climate change, food support. And there were so many great researchers and, folks who did listening sessions, folks who worked in the document, where we can tell you the exact number where we need the money to, like, what we need to sustain ourselves. And I think it's just a great way to just tell folks, hey, solidarity budget is coming. And that is a way that you can see what community needs just by looking at that document. And you can look up Seattle solidaritybudget.com on Google, and you can see that document, what our city needs.
Thanks, Trey. I also think it's just like really important when we talk about rescue means that the folks who are in danger should no longer be endangered. Like when we ask the question, were we rescued? The answer to that question lies in, were the folks in danger safer? Are they no longer in danger? And, I do know this was a struggle at the King County level, was navigating things like investing in certain types of infrastructure around like putting money into courts. And when we know that there's like huge housing crisis, or figuring out like what are the things that are necessary for sustaining a community. Is it maintaining a court system that is still gonna keep going regardless of whether or not we use ARPA funds for it? Or is it ensuring that those folks who are probably still gonna experience prosecution can stay in their homes? And I know that those are challenging things to navigate when doing a budget. And, personally for me as an abolitionist, y'all know where I stand. No shocker there when you got on the live stream with me, is that we should be divesting from those things that are not generating safety and investing in those things that we know are. What were some of the challenges in navigating? And this is like a 2-minute question. I know it's hard to put it into 2 minutes. What was the challenge in navigating like those kinds of investments where people are like, our budget is suffering here, and this is something we've always done, we need this, but in reality, we're talking about rescue dollars. Who really are we rescuing in the process? Councilmember Zahal, I'm gonna throw it to you first. How do we navigate that in the future? How can we be building an ethos that is really about who is actually in danger and what do they really need?
It's a great question, Nikita. I think the real conversation goes back to what Trevana was already saying, which is that we have to invest in the things that actually help people live safe lives. If we put all our money in the court system or the police system, then we are, with just pure mathematics, depriving another area that is more upstream than that of the things people need, that we know if they don't have those things tend to lead to bad decisions, just maybe out of survival or out of anxiety or whatever it might be. And so those were the kinds of decisions that we had to make. I remember there was a specific vote around giving the courts more funding. And this is not a conversation of defunding the courts. The executive branch had already committed a certain number of funds to the courts and sent that proposal over to the council, and the council decided to give more funding to the courts. And I'm not saying it wasn't needed. There's definitely a huge backlog and all these other issues with our criminal legal system. But I do think if we're going to have to make a decision with a limited universe of funding where we put more resources into, I wanted to put more funding into housing, especially homes that are being developed by people who look like the communities and have relationships with the communities that are most unhoused or that are the most housing unstable. So I did make an amendment to try to send millions and millions more of funds into housing, and that amendment did fail. But those are the kinds of decisions that we had to make. Limited universal funds. Do we put more funding into criminal legal systems, or move upstream to make sure that people have the resources they need to be more safe? We know that people are unsafe when they have to live on the street. That's just the truth. If you live on the street, you are at more risk for suffering from gun violence, suffering from assault, suffering from so many of these things. So if we don't put the investment into those places, we are actively allowing conditions that will create violence and crime. And so I wanted to make sure that we invested in those things to bring people indoors to be safer.
Thank you, Councilmember. Brandon, when you think about this limited universe of funding, what are y'all going to do differently in the future about making sure we're getting people out of dangerous situations and into safer ones for real?
Yeah, no doubt. So I think that there are two steps to this, specifically for the realm of education. So if we take a step back from even the funding and realizing, like, what is the funding trying to get us toward? It's a set of really arbitrary benchmarks that don't necessarily meet the needs of today's economy in terms of education, right? So we really need to get really clear about, like, okay, if we're using this funding to educate a child, what does that education need to look like? Where do they need to be at by first grade, second grade, so on and so forth? And so if we're funding to get our children to a very outdated and arbitrary model of, like, how much time do they need to be spending in a classroom, how much of that time needs to be spent on X, Y, and Z subject, what does that actual learning and curricula look like, then we are spending money on something that we know is going to already be out of date and not actually deliver our children to a place to where they need to be self-sufficient. So that's number one. And that's going to take a lot of political will, because the industrial education complex, quite frankly, is so built up to the point to where it's easier just to keep trying to, like, fly this plane instead of, like, landing this thing and really figuring out what are the repairs that need to be made here. What we can also do, and where I think we in Seattle really need to have a serious conversation about, is getting away from the word equity. Quite frankly, folks that don't look like the people on this call have really perverted the word equity. And we need to be really clear that, like, nah, this money is going to Black and brown communities. Because what I've noticed is that, like, as soon as folks who don't look like us get into a space and they start harping about equity and about, like, all the little Black and brown kids that are at their school, when there's probably like 5 or 6 of them, it becomes a conversation around, like, how they use that word to weaponize and really continue to promote their vision of what they want for their school, which has already been the center of how we've developed our system from jump, right? So what I really want us to do is get really clear about what we're doing. Are we being really critical around the curriculum that we're using in front of our students, and being really thoughtful about, like, being serious about the word abolitionist when we're building curriculum and materials? Are we being serious about actually, diverting resources to Black and brown communities and really attach those zip codes to there, and really being very specific and thoughtful about how we are communicating what our intent is? Because if we don't do that, we are going to lose the battle every time, because the folks that look like us are getting priced out. Like I mentioned earlier, I was a teacher for 5 years in Federal Way, and every year I had a higher percentage of folks in South Seattle who had been priced out into those communities. And so as our schools become more and more eroded of their culture in those legacy communities that are going to places like Federal Way and Kent, our ability to organize around these issues becomes less and less viable. So now is the time that we've got people like Alexis, like Germay, and like all of the organizers that we have out in the community to really come together and try to solidify some of the directions and the theories of change that y'all, quite frankly, have been working on for years into policy in a solid roadmap, so that, we're not in a position to where, our systems can be upended, even if the folks who are supposed to be benefiting from it might not necessarily be living in those neighborhoods because of rapid gentrification and rising cost of living. I think the other thing that we need to do is have a better relationship between school boards and every faction of government. I say this in my circles all the time, and I really need to figure out a way to really, get this out. Now that the conservatives have taken over the courts effectively, the next stop is school boards, and it's already happening. And so unless we take this seriously and really start paying attention to who we are electing into school board positions specifically, then we are going to be in a position in the next 5-10 years, and if not sooner, that these are not just conversations about banning critical race theory when folks don't even know what that is, right? These are going to be conversations about what books are you allowed to read? How often are you allowed to talk about slavery? And actually, are we actually going to be talking about our really troubled past in the context of what it actually is? Or are we going to do like Texas and some places like my home state of Mississippi, where we're referring to it as an involuntary relocation? So it's those small types of conversation points and those small instances that are happening right now that are making for really good sound bites in panels and discussions and news stories and whatnot. But it's those insidious points, those small conversations that make their way into the national stage that puts us all on the back foot, figuring out how do we fight against these things when those types of conversations and indoctrinations of how we are really looking to uplift the communities that we're talking about need to be happening now, while we've got the folks that we have in this call in the positions that we do. And it's only going to take a really coordinated, intentional push for us to not only solidify it in terms of the school board, but how does education funding get divvied out at the level of the state? What is DEAL's role to play in this? What is the role of Best Starts for Kids? And how can we take a coordinated approach to protecting some of these things that we have grown to love in Seattle, but also be very cognizant that we are, and by we, I mean school boards, are under a full-fledged assault by the right. And we really have a lot of work that we need to do in this area specifically, or else we're going to see a lot of the negative outcomes like we've seen in the courts.
Thanks, Brandon. Alexis, in the
yes.
world of budgeting.
I will be super quick. I will just say it is Super Mario Brother time. Please eat the mushroom. It is time to level up. And what I mean by that is, I think in 2020, we had great outside engagement to really push government to really start thinking critically. But it's not just the outside, it's the inside game. And how do we start working in a more strategic fashion? We're starting to already craft budget. The executive's already doing that. We are already starting to develop those policies. When we start to hear from community in September and October, it's already done. So we need to start thinking about how are we really engaging people earlier in the year, thinking about how we are investing. I will echo moving away from the performative politics, really start thinking about the root causes. My one little note is I don't want to say that community is very tragic about loss of life, but D2 gets some of the worst messaging. And when we look at the numbers for the last 2 years, 2020, 2021, we have less than 20% of the homicides in this district because the upstream solutions work. Community, all the organizations that are actually engaging in violence prevention actually work. So we need to invest in the things that work in these community solutions because they are beneficial for all of us. So I'll leave it there. And one my last thing, when y'all talk about mobility, it's not just about people getting to workers. We need to start talking about how we are building communities and how we are able to navigate our communities. Not everyone has opportunities to cars. We have some of the highest levels of pedestrian vehicle homicides in South Seattle. We really need to start thinking about how are we building our communities through this influx of money that is going to be coming in.
Absolutely. Thanks, Alexis. And I, just on that tip, I think it's important that we're not, transportation's not just about getting to work. When we make it just about getting to work, we make it just about capitalism, right? Transportation should be about people's ability to get to and from and all the places that they want to be, with family, to the park, to the grocery store, to services, to the hospital. It should be about how we get to live in our neighborhoods, not just how do we get to work, so thank you for that. And as we move into the infrastructure conversation in our next live stream, I hope to bring your wisdom forward to that. Trey, I know that you do a lot of budget organizing, and I'm not going to cut you short. So whoever stays on the live stream stays on. What do you want people to know as we move into this next cycle of budget? Because communities already said what we want. You know what I'm saying? Like, I feel like every year people are like, tell us what you want and need. We're like, we told you last year, we told you year before that, we told you year before that, we told you year before that. How can that be taken into consideration now? What can you invite people into?
Well, I can invite folks to go to www.seattlesolidarityBudget.com. And that is a document that the community has put together from multiple coalitions, organizations, folks that are grassroots, folks that are on the ground, literally getting the opinions and the thoughts and truly listening to what the community needs. That document right there shows you how we can invest as well too. And I think where Alexis was saying, how can we bring the community to the conversation sooner? Because usually when there is the budget season, like we did last year, we were advocating in that, September, October time. And the fact that we still have this budget document that we did not get everything that we truly wanted, we still have the availability to fund the housing portion, the transportation portion, the Green New Deal, food support, childcare access, education, you name it. We still have opportunity to fund that. So I think if, city council members are truly trying to be intentional with getting community priorities, connected into the budget, they need to look at the budget now, and even meeting with folks in Solidarity Budget would be dope as well too. And I just want to end off by saying that it shouldn't just be the community's job to come to the city. The city should be coming to us as well too. And Nikita touched on a point that happens all the time is tell us what you need. Tell us what you need. We tell you every year. We tell you every year. Black folks in this country have been telling, non-Black folks for years how, oppressive it is being here, and it falls in deaf ears. So I think if the city is truly interested in really standing behind its constituents, stop telling those constituents to come to you and come to them specifically, and not just when it's time to have election day, but just throughout that as well, throughout the process as well too, and just making the work intentional and tying that up. And hey, if anybody is interested in supporting Solidarity Budget, you can always sign on to endorse it. We're always looking for endorsers, and we'll have more opportunities coming up during budget season. Just that shameless plug.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to shout out, it's not just the city, it's the county, it's the school board, it's the state, it's the federal government. All these agencies have budgeting, right? Come to the community and, because I don't want Alexis to feel like we only talking to the city. This is a multi-level governmental operation, right, of agencies that need to be reaching out to our most impacted communities, our intersectional communities, our communities that not only are deserving of rescue, but are deserving of investment. It's one thing to get someone to a safe place. It's another thing to sustain that safe space in the way that community has said will keep them safe. I want to thank y'all for joining us for the American Rescue Plan Act, Where We Rescued. Special shout out to Councilmember Girmay Zahalai, to School Board and Political Director for Protect 17, Brendan Hersey, to Chief of Staff. I was like, how can I give Alexis an additional title? Because when I say Councilmember Zahalai, I want to be like Queen Alexis. Thank you so much for your time and your energy for being here with us. And shout out to Trevonna Thompson Wiley, community organizer, doing this from day one, making sure that our communities on the front lines are being served. This is not the last live stream we will be doing. We will be doing another one on August 20th, 12 p.m. to 1:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Infrastructure, Investments, and Job Acts. What is infrastructure for the people? We have an incredible panel for our next live stream. Sean Glaze, who's the Chief Consulting Officer at Inclusive Data. Kirsten Harris-Talley, neighbor and community healer. Jode Nguyen, Washington State Senator for the 34th Legislative District. Katie Wilson, who's the General Secretary of the Transit Writers Union, and we just outed Port Commissioner Toshiko Hasagawa. So really excited to be talking about infrastructure with our communities and what that looks like. Also, if you are interested in figuring out how to better organize around the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act, we will be hosting webinars on August 25th, 2:30 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 5:30 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. We'll be hosting one specifically for Northeast Turtle Island, Northeast United States. We'll host another one on September 20th that is focused on the Pacific Northwest. So that will be a 5:30 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And then on September 27th, thinking about the South and the Southeast, which will be 5:30 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. What do you need to do as a community member to make sure your voice is heard around the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act, so that it is the kind of investments that serve our Black, Brown, Indigenous communities, our disabilities communities, our queer and trans communities, our communities that need access to infrastructure now. So thank you again for your time. My name is Nikita Oliver, and I am really honored to be hosting and navigating this federal spending series with you.